do have one more book talk. We're going to enjoy a pre-recorded presentation by our next speaker, who I'll introduce now. So the next book talk is on a book by Suryamayi Aswini Clarence-Smith called Prefiguring Utopia, the Auroville Experiment. And a little bit about her. Suryamayi is an award-winning scholar, educator, and facilitator based in Auroville, India, the largest intentional community in the world. Suryamayi holds a PhD in international development from the University of Sussex and a BA from the University of California, Berkeley. She is currently affiliated with the Aurobindo International Institute for Educational Research in Auroville. Her research on utopian and prefigurative practice has been published by leading editors and publishers in the field, notably in the Ralahain Utopia Studies series, the Alternatives to Capitalism in the 21st Century series, and the Antipode book series. Dedicated to sharing the outcomes of her research to various audiences, she lectures internationally in both academic and activist settings. And I'm going to play a video, and then we can engage with her in question and answers. Correct.
There's Devashish and Jonathan and everyone else involved for putting together this conference at the occasion of Aurobindo's 150th anniversary. There are so many scholars here whose work I've been curious about for years, and others who I've discovered thanks to this event, so it's been great to be able to participate. My name is Suryamayi Clarence-Smith, and I am joining to present my book, which is just being published by Bristol University Press, and is a scholarly autoethnographic exploration of the Auroville community, which I was born and raised in, and am currently a member of. So the book is an adaptation of my PhD project, which I had the pleasure to present in person at CIS in 2018 at a conference organized by Devashish and others as well at the occasion of the 50th anniversary of both Auroville and CIS. And it's wonderful to come full circle and present back the final outcome. I wish I could be there in person, but I'm grounded from air travel at the moment, and the internet is also pretty patchy where I am, so hence the video. But I hope to be able to join you live for the Q&A. So we're coming to the end of this conference, and all of you here are familiar with Auroville by now. There have been several other presentations made on the community over the last few days, and so I'm just really going to take you straight into a deep dive of the key sort of scholarly contributions of this work, rather than starting with a general introduction to Auroville. And in keeping with the character of this conference, which is primarily paper-based, I'll actually be reading out some passages from the book along the way. And I'll also offer some moments of contemplative pause. Those have been a really wonderful part of the event so far. So with that, I invite us all to take a couple of deep breaths. Perhaps even gently close our eyes. And with your eyes closed or just with your lids lowered, I'd like to invite you to allow an image of the Auroville community to appear before you. Now it might be a memory from a time that you visited Auroville, or maybe it's just a vision that appears to you in this given moment. It might also be that it takes a little while to come, or that nothing visual comes to you, and this is fine as well. So just be with whatever is there before and within you, and notice any sensations or emotions that arise in your being in association with this. Take a nice few deep breaths, breathing into whatever it is that you're experiencing. And then gently allow yourself to resurface, to open your eyes, and to return your attention to the room. So welcome back. Now that we've had a moment to each connect with Auroville, which is at the center of today's presentation in a contemplative way, let's dive into a more traditionally analytical approach to the subject. So I'd like to begin by unpacking these big words in the title of the book, Prefiguring Utopia. And I'll start with utopia, the concept of utopia. And I'll be reading from the book as I do so. I'll be drawing from the book as I do so. So intentional communities such as Auroville are often categorized as utopian projects. Although it's really important to know that this framing is actually contentious for many, from academics to intentional community members themselves. And now this is largely because of the dominant identification of the concept of utopia with a fixed ideal of perfection, which many intentional community members feel that they are far from. And also its association with a detailed, predetermined blueprint, which is a source of concern due to the dogmatism that it can engender. Now, these associations with the word utopia are not without basis, but they are by and large outdated. So contemporary utopian scholars consider it to be mistaken to understand utopias as, quote, perfection-seeking, blueprinting, or desirous of perfection and finality. And in the last several decades, there has been a radical move away from the idea of utopia as synonymous with perfection, fixity, and the intangible, towards that of an experimental practice that is dynamic, changeable, flexible, reflexive, and also self-critical, that is about a drive for perfectibility rather than perfection. Now, this evolutionary dimension and purpose of utopian practice I find to be congruent with Auroville's ontological framework of integral yoga, which seeks to hasten the spiritual evolution of consciousness through an applied embodiment in the present. The utopian philosopher Ernst Bloch, who is really to be credited for catalyzing the reformulation of the very concept of utopia, insisted that utopian ideals must be connected to potential embedded in existing reality, no matter how compromised the present conditions. Now, this stands in very stark contrast to the conceptualization embedded in the very origin of the term utopia, which is a combination of two Greek words, utopos, or good place, and utopos, or no place. The implication being that utopia is an imaginary, abstract, and also unattainable ideal. So the mother conceived of Auroville as an experiment dedicated to a sort of foreshadowed evolutionary practice, as envisaged by Bloch. And it's on this redefined basis that I use the concept of utopia as a theoretical lens, an analytical lens, to understand the practice of evolving a new society that Aurovillians are engaged in. So I want to take a few moments to let that reformulation sink in. And to support another contemplative pause as you do so, I'd like to read you a quote by Oscar Wilde that I feel captures the essence of what I just shared in just a few evocative lines. He writes, "A map of the world that does not include utopia is not worth even glancing at, for it leaves out the one country at which humanity is always landing. And when humanity lands there, it looks out and seeing a better country sets sail. Progress is the realization of utopias. So let's move on to our second big word, which is prefiguration. And again from the book, prefiguration is central to how I understand utopian practice in the Auroville context. Because prefiguration is a practice in which a collective emulates in the present the attitudes, social relations, culture, and organization that it envisions for the future through, quote, experiential and experimental means. Now, the term prefigurative was coined in 1970 by the cultural anthropologist Margaret Mead, who was an early endorser of the Auroville project, to herald the advent of a newly future-oriented prefigurative culture, one in which, quote, it will be the child and not the parent and grandparent that represents what is to come. Now, in 1977, the term prefiguration was first used to define the embodiment within the political practice of a movement of those forms of social relations, decision-making, culture, and human experience that are its ultimate goal. The context was the new left social movements, precipitated and shaped by radical changes in culture and lifestyle that arose in the 1960s, peaking in 1968, the year that Auroville was founded, with the Students' Revolt in Paris, which the mother took a personal interest in. Now, in the last decade, or maybe even a bit more, the label prefigurative has risked becoming exclusive to horizontal forms of organizing and decision-making in social movements such as Occupy Wall Street. And this very restrictive scope is perhaps why prefiguration had barely been associated with utopianism when I started with my work. But it seemed evident to me that those articulating this form of prefigurative politics are driven by the desire to live in a radically different society, shaped by alternative values than that of mainstream capitalism. Capitalism understood not only as an economy, but a society. And it also seemed evident that such an alternative society needs to be prefigured in all its aspects: education, work, social relations. And this is where the prefigurative and the utopian seem to me to be evident allies. So I consider the utopianism as conceived and practiced in the Auroville context to not only be prefigurative, but spiritually prefigurative. Because the premise of the Auroville project is to evolve into a spiritualized society through a transformational practice of informing everyday life and activities with spiritually enlightened ideals, values, and consciousness, following Sri Aurobindo's iconic phrase, all life is yoga. Now, to use the same theoretical concept, in this case prefiguration, to analyze both political and spiritual practice may seem like a stretch to some. But over the last 50 years, Auroville has been a focal point for pioneering innovative forms of collective and economic organization, renewable technologies, sustainable architecture, educational practices, and social enterprises, with award-winning local, regional, national, and international reach and impact. And I have heard several fellow Aurovillians describe these as simply byproducts of the underlying spiritual mission of the community. So this active role of spirituality in reshaping society is especially interesting to consider, given that a prevalent criticism of spiritual practice is that it renders individuals apolitical, in the sense of disengaged from the shaping of society. Now, it's relevant to note that academic work endorsing this critique is based on Buddhist-inspired practices such as mindfulness, which do emphasize a detachment from worldly life. And by contrast, the spiritual worldview of integral yoga is one that sees the world as a realm to be divinized through a practice of cultivating not only, quote, spiritual consciousness within, but also spiritual life without. So engaging in pursuits of worldly life with an applied spirituality in order to participate in transforming these. So if the aspiration of Aurovillians as a polity is an embodied, individual and collective evolution of spiritual consciousness in everyday life, then I would argue that any activity in which they intentionally engage with this spiritually prefigurative process, whether a physical discipline, artistic production, in a political form, is fundamental to Auroville's development as a spiritual polity. As has been evoked throughout this conference and is deeply examined and elucidated throughout my book, Auroville is a society with many challenges and contradictions. Now, in prefigurative practice, it is understood that, quote, the struggle and the goal, the real and the ideal, become one in the present. That it is a practice to be engaged within the limitations of a given present context, with the objective of very practically, progressively, and ultimately transforming these. Because there is no utopia the way it was historically conceived, right? All we have is our present contexts and our present realities. And this is where prefiguration, I think, is a very interesting and pertinent lens to apply to utopianism as we understand it today. So in the book, I explore how the Auroville community has engaged in a spiritually prefigurative utopianism throughout political, cultural, and economic realms of community life and development, while navigating contextual challenges both internal to Auroville and to the broader political, economic, and sociocultural context in which it is embedded. We will not have the time today to fully delve really at all into the content and findings of each of these chapters. So I invite you to read the book for that. But what I do want to address, given the focus on sustainability in this conference, is the sustaining of this overarching spiritually prefigurative utopian practice in the Auroville context. So many scholars emphasize the role of hope as a primary and sustaining force for utopian endeavor. Ernst Bloch's work, who I mentioned before, is called The Principle of Hope. Now, from autoethnographic observation and experience, I consider it necessary to add the dimension of disappointment, as I've found this to actually be key in fostering an ongoing drive for societal change within Auroville. And I would go so far as to extrapolate that it is the tension between these two forces, hope and disappointment, that can engender the dynamism at the core of utopian practice, certainly of grassroots utopian practice, as practiced in Auroville, as practiced in any experimental project. So, criticism is a natural ally to disappointment. Tom Moylan, who is among the contemporary scholars of utopianism, recently published a book called Becoming Utopian, has defined some utopias as critical in what he calls both the Enlightenment sense of critique, that is, the expressions of oppositional thought, of unveiling, of debunking, and also in the nuclear sense of a critical mass. So to this double meaning of critical, I suggest that we add the dimension of self-critique in order to actually better understand the subjective experiences of utopian practice and intentional communities. Now, the dynamic of self-critique has already been highlighted by others, such as Lucy Sargison, for example, who observes that members are often excessively critical of their community. She's an intentional community scholar herself. Now, this is certainly true of Auroville, and I would argue that it is one key to fueling a continued process of perfectibility, as long as hope remains unseated. Now, of hope, Bloch says, it is in love with success rather than failure. Yet Frederick Jameson points out that utopias also have something to do with failure and tell us more about our own limits and weaknesses than they do about perfect societies. Sargison, who I mentioned before, has remarked that utopias are a mirror to the present, designed to bring out flaws. While Lyman Tower Sargent was perhaps the foremost bibliographer of utopia, remarks that utopia is a life of hope. We can hope, fail, and hope again. We can live with repeated failure and still improve the societies we build. I'd like us to pause here and reflect on that. We can live with repeated failure and still improve the societies we build. I think one of the reasons why it's so tempting to criticize utopian projects is because they are engaged in the process of trying to improve societies. And I often wonder whether we shouldn't be more critical of societies and communities that are not trying. In an earlier talk in this conference, Devashish evoked different sort of movements in which social reform was attempted, Marxism, communism, and that it was a psychological aspect that was missing from these previous experiments, attempts, conceptualizations. And I think that's also interesting to consider when we think of this quote, utopia is a life of hope. We can hope, fail, and hope again. We can live with repeated failure and still improve the societies we build. It's about, from the psychological perspective, it's about being engaged in that process, dedicating ourselves to that process, which is key. And in my work, this is why I really focused on process and why I've highlighted that here. Because in the book, as you read it, as you read how this plays out in different aspects of the community and how this has worked out and what has worked and what hasn't worked and all of these things, that's fine and it's important. But for me, what was the most important was to understand what triggers this process. What is it that inspires people to engage in utopian practice, in community, collectively, and inspires them to continue despite disappointment, despite failures, to carry on, to stay engaged in this process. And it was fascinating to see how important was the role of ideals and the role of the spiritual in this. And now those ideals might change from place to place. The goals might change. The desired outcomes might change. And so what I thought I might be able to contribute with my work is, how can the process be engaged and sustained? So when we look at Auroville, the ideals of the community, as outlined in its founding texts, so the Auroville Charter, to be a true Aurovillian, a dream, they articulate and inspire the collective hope of the community. And at the same time, they're a constant gauge against which Aurovillians critique themselves and often each other. Now, the spiritual worldview of Antico Yoga plays a really crucial role in framing and also assists in weathering our disappointment with the human limitations and flaws that we Aurovillians routinely face in ourselves and others in community life and development. And according to this worldview, such limitations are symptomatic of the overarching stage of spiritual consciousness in which humanity is presently caught. Because it maintains that this spiritual consciousness is in a process of evolution, and that we can choose to actively participate in it, this spiritual worldview is also key to sustaining hope. So as such, the spiritually prefigurative rootedness of the Auroville project is crucial to sustaining its utopian practice. And as I evoked earlier, this crucial role of spirituality in sustaining utopian practice is one of the key contributions of my work. And that ties in ever so neatly with the key themes being explored in this conference, which are arguably sustainability and spirituality. So on that fortuitous note, I'd like to close this talk, which also closes the conference, and express my gratitude for spaces that allow us to engage with the role of spirituality in society in a dedicated way. Thank you. Also, for those of you at CIIS, the book will soon be available in the library. It's being shipped as we speak. And the publisher is extending a 50% discount to all of you attending the conference. So the code is capital letters CON23 for online purchase on the Bristol University Press website. And there might be a poster lying around somewhere with these details. So I'll stop the video here and be right with you for the Q&A, internet connection allowing.
Thanks, Suryamayi, for that that wonderful wonderful presentation on your work. Devashish, would you like to start by addressing Surya's presentation?
I just wanted to appreciate the talk, and actually I think the book that Suryamayi talked about came in to CIIS today, and I just wanted to acknowledge the talk and the the idea of utopia which Suryamayi is presenting as a process with room in it for hope, aspiration, failure, as well as learning, continuous learning. So with that, I think let's open it up and see if we have questions from the audience. And
Yes, at this point we have nothing, but I'm hoping something will come through. Sometimes the attendees might be a little shy, but please, we welcome any questions. Well, I could ask a question, Suryamayi. I mean, something came up as you were speaking in terms of the difference between ideals and idealism and the structure of that. And you did, bring in the importance of the ontology of metaphysics of integral yoga. And I just wanted to ask you to describe that a little bit more in terms of how is it that in the grassroots approach you're speaking about, how you balance that the difference between having an ideal, a collective structure of aspiration is why that's the term I use in my presentation, as opposed to having how that kind of can slowly or quickly, consciously and unconsciously, kind of crystallize into an idealism, which really breaks apart kind of the fabric of the experimental aspect of the utopian practice. And the other thing I guess I would like to add to that, because you did speak about experimentalism and the idea of disappointment and hope and failure, and I was wondering how I sort of see that it's almost like a false problem in a way, in some sense, in the sense of, in experimental practice, is there really truly failure? Because do you really go into that practice with an image of what this is supposed to be? That seems to be not how I understand experimentalism. And so that's where I think that it's interesting to think about. I do understand, yes, there's going to be certain projects in Auroville, for instance, where you can say, well, that failed, that didn't work. But in a very surface level, but in another level, if it's really based on experimental practice, it's not a failure or a success per se. It's just the modality of deepening the relations between between elements in this practice. So those are just a couple of comments that you can respond how you'd like.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, great. Yeah, these are great comments and really kind of touch at the root of, what I try to elucidate in my work, and really what we sort of come up against in actual practice, right? So we can talk about these concepts, hope, failure, aspiration, ideals, but how does this actually really then play out when we are experimenting collectively? And what I would say, what I would respond to your kind of second question around experimentation and how can we even conceive of, let's say, failure, if the premise of what we're doing is experimenting. What I would say, from the lens of my work and in Auroville, is that the lens that I apply, this kind of prefigurative lens that I apply for looking at Auroville, is basically sort of a litmus test. This prefiguration is a litmus test, is to say, in the experiments that are happening, because there are many, are these experiments engaging with the ideals of the community? And are they, in that engagement, are we seeing this kind of, again, as Debashish mentioned, this psychological development happening? So are we seeing from a process perspective that this experimenting is actually engaging with the ideals, engaging within us in moving closer towards those ideals? And this is where this reframing of looking at process rather than outcome, I think is really important. But I think we can talk about whether the process, whether an experiment is just like, oh, we're just experimenting with something, without actually really consciously looking at the ideals, consciously trying to embody, a spiritually prefigurative practice state. I think that is something, that is that litmus test. That is something that we can say, is it that kind of experiment that we're engaging in? Because this is not just experimenting for the sake of experimenting, right? And this is where this prefigurative aspect, I think, is really, really key. And that brings me to your first comment around ideals and idealism. And here again, for me, the prefiguration is again that litmus test. And I think it's important, to although the mother did talk about certain kind of arrangements that she envisioned, for the economy, let's say, she even had some ideas for the political organization. I think it's really important to note that for a lot of these, she emphasized the transitory nature. She emphasized these as sort of a starting point to where she could see it could go, but there was no blueprint as such. Because if the premise of Auroville is to basically participate in this hastening of, the evolution of spiritual consciousness, which is this ontology of the integral world, which is the purpose, right, of the practice, the applied practice of the integral world, then we don't know what that next stage of consciousness is going to generate. We don't know what is going to emerge from that. Now, the mother and Aurobindo and others, had glimpses of where that could go, and the mother specifically, started experimenting this in a communal way in the Aurobindo ashram. But she saw the limitations of that in that project and wanted to try for a different experiment. So it's not that this was experienced also collectively, whatever their own personal individual experiences might have been. So that's where, again, very important to have, a certain sense of ideal and sort of in the sense of an aspiration, something to really be able to, again, engage these experiments within and towards, so that we're not just kind of floating in something that, what are we really working towards? But again, to resist an idealism because we're in an evolutionary process. And the approach to this might change, or what emerges, might change. And I think that's really the beautiful, the beautiful challenge of engaging this kind of with this evolutionary dimension, is that we don't know, and that can be incredibly uncomfortable. We don't know, and so that's where there's a certain, I think, sense of digging much deeper within into, again, this psychological, psychic aspect of the experience of what is the experience, what is the process bringing up, because it's not about, we don't have the same markers in the outer life, in the outer society. That's not what we're working with. We're working with something with an inner development primarily.
Yes, thank you for that. There's a couple questions from the attendees here. Paman has a question. Have you included the concept of karma yoga in your work, since you mentioned the framework of integral yoga?
Yes, absolutely. I do discuss karma yoga. I discuss it specifically so as I mentioned, the book is, let's say, divided into 3 parts. Culture, so one dealing with culture, one dealing with economy, and one dealing with the political development. And in culture, I consider a whole range of different sort of, let's say, cultural practices widely understood, and how these might be spiritually prefigurative. And one of those is work. So really understanding actually work. What does spiritually prefigurative work look like? And that is a section in which I delve deeply into karma yoga and how that completely sort of spiritually revolutionizes the concept of really the purpose of work, and of how work is engaged in a spiritual process. Yeah.
Great. Another question from Charles. Can you discuss the challenge of trying to build an idealistic township or city in a world context of postmodern cynicism and compounded the rise of late-stage capitalism, capitalist authoritarianism? How do we build collective resilience and not just individual resilience?
Yes, this is a this is a great question, a very important question. I mean, so the book is actually published in the Alternatives to Capitalism series in Bristol University Press. So it is definitely something that I discuss and that I consider in the book. And that series, the Alternatives to Capitalism series, is really about, again, I mentioned it in the talk at some point, is about understanding capitalism not just as an economy, but as a society, right? So in that sense, how does capitalism, for example, we just spoke about work, how does that completely shape the way we view work, right? I mean, it's almost become like a worldview in which, or education, in which, education, the purpose of education becomes in order to join a workforce. I mean, everything is sort of, feeding into this, really, it's almost in its own ontology.
Suryamayi, I think we've lost you. We'll give it a second in case the feed catches up.
Oh.
Okay.
When I'm back.
Yep, it sounds like you're back.
I'm back. Okay.
Sentences there.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. So I just wanted to share that it is challenging. It is challenging to build an alternative within a dominant mainstream that is very different, basically, from what you're trying to prefigure. And this is where I think that communal experiments, so the person was evoking the difference between individual and collective resilience. Communal experiments are so important, and communal experiments with a certain critical mass are so important. Now, these remain incredibly niche projects, right? I mean, Auroville is by far the largest intentional community in the world. It has 3,300 people. I mean, I know it's, it doesn't really make sense to compare, but it's, that's a bit bigger than a village, so if we're really looking at scale. But to have a certain critical mass in which, and again, it was Devashish was mentioning yesterday around this kind of economic aspect and around Auroville and around how, the subsistence aspect is so important. So you need a certain critical mass so that even just subsistence can be taken care of, so that you can really sort of experiment with something different. Speaking with longer term residents of Auroville also is that as India sort of opened up its economy, liberalized its economy in the 90s, the impacts of that were felt in Auroville also, in terms of the kind of, the surrounding context shifting. So it is very challenging. There are a lot of different theories around how we can sort of prefigure alternatives to capitalism. One of them is by this kind of what they call interstitial change, rather than sort of like big, kind of revolutions. So these kind of experimental, incremental changes that sort of demonstrate what could be done differently. But yeah, to be honest, it's a really big challenge, and how that might be transformed at a world scale is something that is difficult to envision. Yeah. But it's beautiful to see experiments where we see that other ways are possible, even if they are at a small scale. And to actually experience those, I think, is really empowering in terms of bringing that into other contexts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And here's a short question from Michael. What does success look like?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So again, these how do we kind of deal with these big concepts, success, failure? Again, taking a kind of, inspiration rootedness in the integral yoga sort of ontology. I would say it's more, and also this brings back to the last talk that we had on Aurobindo and his work and emotions. It's how does success feel like? I would say, rather than how does it look like? How does success feel like? Because as we mentioned, utopia is, we're not going to get these old conceptualizations of utopias where all of a sudden everything's perfect. Unfortunately, I mean that's just not the reality that we live in. But how can we have experiences? And growing up in Auroville, I have to share that I've had these experiences of where it just feels like, this is what we're trying to do. This is how it feels. This kind of sort of a psychic being sort of feeling resonance. This kind of resonance. I've experienced it, for example, and I have a passage on this in the book, in the awareness through the body practices, so which are an integral component of the educational aspect of Auroville, and it's a program in which children from a very young age are invited to explore all these different parts of the being and to really connect to themselves from the center. And there's also a lot of work that we do, collectively with others. And there's a passage where I discuss, reflecting on, how would it be, if we related to each other in this way, in the same way in our political forums, in our decision-making spaces, in Auroville itself. So it's this feeling of like, oh yeah, this here we're touching something. So I would say, how does success feel like, maybe, rather than how does it look like?
Yes, beautiful. So well said. And what came to mind was when the feeling of getting the power to, or the energy, I was going to say that the practice itself is self-generative and synergetic in the sense that it gives more energy back to you. It fills you with more potentials to do more work, to do more experimenting. That's what was coming up for me.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and when we come back also to the notion of karma yoga, right, which is so central to the integral yoga, in the sense that we are asked to do the swadharma that is being asked of us. And I just love the Bhagavad Gita's elucidation of this, where it's like, it doesn't matter if it's even something that you are good at. You're not looking at it from an exterior point of view. It's about what it is that you are being called to do, and completely surrendering the fruits of that action, even sort of the rationale, because it's beyond the mental, right? And so those are spaces too, and those are experiences I think people really have. I feel like I've had in Auroville around just this feeling of, I'm being called to do this, and I maybe can't explain it, mentally or in terms of indicators or outcomes, but it just feels, there's just there's that resonance there, and that is again from the perspective of the inner and the kind of psychological development, that is a sign, right, of so-called success, of being on the being in connection.
Yeah, beautiful. I just have one last question, and Devashish, maybe we can end with some comments and questions from you. But you were talking about the affect of this kind of intuitive and this affect of knowing when the process is happening in a certain way. And I guess it didn't seem like it was one of the main sections of your book, but I'm sure it came up. But the aesthetics of this kind of practice, is that something that you dwelt on at all, or that comes up in your book?
Yeah. So there is the section on this, yes, in the culture part of the book, where I discuss specifically the artistic practice of the community. I don't go into, so this will resonate with you, Jonathan. I don't go into it in great depth, but sort of talking about the spiritually prefigurative aspects the artistic practice, whether it's music, whether it's theater, because we do see a lot of artistic work in Auroville that engages, for example, with the text of Aurobindo or the Mother, or that engages with, for example, in the theater, so some theater that we will see, for example, being played in the Much Mandir, which is really so clearly distinct and singular from other forms of within that artistic practice, is to, in that moment, embody, a kind of spiritually centered state, a spiritually aspiring state. So that, yes, that's something that I have a section on in the book.
Yes, thank you, Suryamayi. One thing that, I think it was so revealing, the whole idea of trying to contextualize Auroville in terms of process in the making. One of the things that you mentioned is that, as you said, it's such a large community. It's the largest intentional community, and it has its history, and it's achieved so much. When you look at it today, you really see that it's achieved so much ecological work, so much cultural work. And in a way, we are just back. We took about 16 of us went to Auroville, and they experienced firsthand something remarkable. They experienced not only the life of Auroville, but something intangible, which you definitely feel there. But I think what you said about, in a way, these are all byproducts, that they're in the process, that they multiply, and to think of them as end results is itself a problem. But I think you do have these metrics, as you were pointing out, the metrics of prefiguration, that I was thinking needs to some extent become part of the community. Because, you mentioned that there is no blueprint as such. There is no fixed telos, and even the mother would propose things, but keep them open. And I'd say maybe unless that sense of a metric, which is not necessarily a telos, arises, there may be the danger, both kinds of dangers, the danger of not knowing where one is going, and on the other hand, trying to impose blueprints of various kinds in the guise of this is what the mother wants and this is what we have to do right now, etc. Would you like to say something about that?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Devashish. Yeah, it's a very important consideration. And I think that, perhaps one of the reasons why that's not present, or why even perhaps it's been shied away from, is, in the kind of ontology and, of the integral yoga, and kind of how this practice manifests, individually, that there is such a respect, let's say, in the conceptualization of the integral yoga for the individual pathway, right? That we cannot actually define what progress looks like for an individual. In a way, of course, there are certain indicators, in a sense. We know that we're looking for, ever more having the psychic being coming to the fore, right? And ever more directing, the all the other parts of the being. So, of course, that there are certain things that are present, or again, like what was brought up in the different talk, the qualities of bhakti, or the quality, these qualities that arise, that are fostered, in this sort of, as we really turn ourselves towards the spiritual consciousness. But in terms of what the journey, let's say, looks like, there's no kind of blueprint there on the individual. And if there's nothing there on the individual, it's even more difficult to say, how do we put something on the collective, in a sense. But as you rightly say, this does leave things open for unless we don't define it, and unless we are in a state of trust to a certain extent, then it does leave it very vulnerable to certain kinds of impositions, or to certain, like I pointed out, this excessive self-criticism also, and these fears and all these things that come out of, are we progressing? Are we, are we moving towards, are we not? Oh no, we're not. Okay, we need to do it. So we need to work with this and this to get there. And then these things can become impositions, and these things can become blueprinting. And so I guess I don't really have the answer